I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. The walls of our house were thin, thinner than they should have been. And that night, the quiet made everything worse. The air was heavy, almost waiting, and when I passed by his room, the words cut through the silence like a blade. She looks just like her mother. His voice was low, almost thoughtful, but there was something else underneath, something I couldn't place. A rough sigh followed, then the sound of ice clinking against glass. He was drinking again. The whiskey bottle was probably halfway gone, but that wasn't what sent a shiver down my spine. It was the way he said it. Like he wasn't just talking about resemblance. Like it meant something more. I should have kept walking, pretended I didn't hear. But my feet wouldn't move. My hands curled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. The room was dimly lit from the crack under the door, a faint golden glow spilling out. The longer I stood there, the more I felt it. The strange, twisting tension that had been creeping into the spaces between us for months. I knew I should leave. Go back to my room. Forget it. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for the door. The door was open now. Just a crack, but enough. Enough to see him, slumped in his chair. His fingers curled loosely around the whiskey glass. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, exposing the tension in his forearms. The low lamp beside him cast shadows over his face, deepening the lines around his mouth, his eyes half-lidded, unreadable. I should have walked away. Instead, I stepped inside. "You shouldn't be up," he muttered, not looking at me. His voice was rougher than usual, the drink thick in his throat. "Neither should you." He chuckled under his breath, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes when he finally lifted them to me. A second passed. Maybe two. The silence was weighted, as if the air itself had turned solid. My pulse quickened. I shifted on my feet, suddenly aware of how small the room felt. How warm. His gaze flickered downward just for a second, before he took another slow sip of his drink. "You always used to sneak out of bed when you were little. Sit on the stairs listening. You thought I didn't know." I swallowed. "I remember." And now he asked, his voice lower. "Are you here to listen again?" I knew I should step back, but my feet stayed planted. He was watching me differently now, like he was measuring something, waiting for me to break the silence first. My skin felt too tight, too aware. "I heard you say something earlier," I said before I could stop myself. "About Mom. About me." He stilled, his fingers gripping the glass just a little harder. "You shouldn't be listening to things that aren't meant for you." I licked my lips, nervous. His eyes flicked to the movement, then back up. The room felt even smaller now, the space between us shrinking despite neither of us moving. "Maybe you shouldn't be saying things that make me wonder." The tension snapped, sharp and sudden. He exhaled, setting the drink down with a controlled slowness that only made my heart hammer harder. When he stood, I felt it like a shift in gravity. He wasn't close, not yet, but he was closer than before, and that was enough. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. "Then tell me." A muscle jumped in his jaw. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the ice melting in his glass. The world outside this room didn't exist. It was just this. Just us. I should have looked away. Should have turned and left and pretended nothing about this felt different. But I didn't. And neither did he. The silence between us thickened, suffocating. The low lamp in the corner cast flickering shadows, throwing his face into sharp relief. The tightness in his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I should have left the room. I should have turned back, pretended none of this had happened, pretended I hadn't heard the words slip from his lips earlier. But I stayed. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was him. But suddenly I was closer. Close enough to see the shift in his breathing, the way his chest rose and fell with something restrained. "You're looking at me differently," I whispered before I could stop myself. His throat bobbed. "No, I'm not." A lie. We both knew it. I swallowed, every nerve on fire. "Then say it." His eyes flashed. "Say what?" "Say you don't feel it," I challenged, my pulse hammering, daring him to shut this down, to end it before it went somewhere neither of us could take back. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "You need to go to bed." The deflection sent a sharp thrill through me, frustration curling in my stomach. "Why won't you just say it?" His jaw clenched. Because I can't. The words sent a bolt through my spine, like the last thread holding us together had snapped. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name but had felt building for too long. Then came the mistake. I stepped closer. Too close. I saw the exact second his breath hitched, the flicker of something dark in his gaze, warning me, pleading with me. Go to bed, he said again, but his voice was hoarse this time. My hand moved before I could think. Just a touch, light, barely there, fingertips brushing his wrist. The instant contact sent a shock through me like I'd grabbed a live wire. I expected him to pull away. He didn't. Instead, his fingers twitched, responding before his mind could stop them. A sharp inhale. His head tilted slightly, like he was about to say something, but the words caught in his throat. I shouldn't have moved closer. I did. The storm outside cracked through the night, and it was like something broke inside him. His hand lifted, hesitated, then skimmed my arm. Barely a touch, but enough to make my breath stutter. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I opened my mouth. The words wouldn't come. His fingers curled, pressing just enough that I felt it. His warmth, his restraint unraveling. The air between us pulsed, like the whole room was holding its breath. I should have said something. I should have turned. But my body was frozen, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted, what I craved. Then, the front door slammed. We jolted apart, the air between us shattering like glass. Footsteps. Voices. The world crashed back into place. He took 3 steps back, his hand still half raised like he hadn't fully processed what just happened. His breathing was uneven, his eyes dark, unreadable. His voice cracked, raw and strained. This can't happen. I couldn't speak, couldn't think, because I knew. It already had. The storm outside raged, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat, or at least that's what I told myself. But inside it was deafening. He stood across the room, his back to me, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles went white. I didn't move. I should have. I should have turned around and walked away, put distance between us before this spiraled out of control. But I didn't. Not when I could still feel the heat of his skin lingering in the space between us. Not when the air felt charged, electric, like the room itself was holding its breath. I need you to go, he said, voice tight. But I could hear the lie in it. He wasn't asking me to leave because he wanted me to. He was asking me to leave because he was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to listen. I swallowed hard. My pulse roared in my ears. I was hyper-aware of everything, of the way my fingers twitched at my sides, of the way his shoulders tensed when I shifted forward just an inch. A test. He didn't move away. I took another step. Stop, he said, but it came out weak, almost broken. I did. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted him to tell me again. Tell me no. Tell me to walk away before this line disappeared forever. But he didn't. He turned instead, and when our eyes locked, the tension snapped. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would be lethal but leaning forward anyway. Don't do this, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I let out a shaky breath. Then stop me. A challenge. A plea. Something flickered behind his eyes. I could see it, the war inside him, the battle between right and wrong, between restraint and surrender. It lasted a second. Maybe less. Then, he moved. I barely had time to react before the distance between us was gone. It was desperate. Messy. A collision of everything we'd been holding back, of months, years, of tension bursting all at once. His hands were in my hair, gripping too tight like he was afraid to let go. I gasped against his skin, nails digging into his back, the heat between us unbearable. And for a moment I forgot. Forgot the consequences. Forgot the weight of what this meant. I let myself sink into it, into him, into the way his breath tangled with mine until... a noise. Loud. Too close. We tore apart like we'd been burned, breathless and shaken. Footsteps. Someone was awake. Reality slammed back into place like a slap to the face. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, my body still reeling from what had just happened. His hands went to his face, rubbing over his jaw like he could erase this moment, like he could take it all back. But he couldn't. Neither of us could. The door creaked down the hall. Someone was coming. "We can't do this," he said hoarsely, but his voice shook. I backed away, my pulse hammering. The moment was gone, but the damage was already done. The silence between us was deafening. I hadn't moved from the spot where I stood, my breath still uneven, my skin still burning from where he had touched me. He wouldn't look at me. His back was turned, shoulders tense, hands braced on the counter like he was holding himself together by sheer force. The storm outside had calmed, but inside the air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on us like the weight of what we had just done would crush us both. I swallowed, forcing words out even though they tasted foreign in my mouth. "What happens now?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, gripping the counter tighter like he could ground himself with it. "Nothing." Hit like a slap, like he could just erase it, pretend it never happened. I should have expected it, but it still hurt. I took a step back, arms wrapping around myself as if that could shield me from the cold creeping into my bones. "You're just going to pretend?" My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. His jaw clenched. "We have to." A bitter laugh slipped past my lips before I could stop it. "Right. Because that's worked so well before." He turned then, eyes locking onto mine, and for a second, just a second, I saw it. The wreckage. The war still raging beneath the surface, the same one tearing me apart. But then he shut it down. Just like that. His face hardened, his expression unreadable, like a mask sliding into place. "This can't happen again." A statement. Not a plea. Not a question. It was final. A lump formed in my throat, thick and heavy. So that's it. Silence. I waited. For something. Anything. But nothing came. His breathing was slow and controlled, but I could still hear the uneven edge in it. Could still feel the tension crackling between us. We weren't the same people we had been 10 minutes ago. We would never be those people again. I nodded slowly, backing toward the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Okay. I didn't know what I meant by that. I wasn't sure if it was a goodbye or a challenge. I reached for the door, but I hesitated just for a second. My fingers trembled on the handle, and then I left. The hallway was dark, the house eerily quiet now that the storm had passed. My footsteps felt too loud against the floor. Each step heavy, final, like I was sealing something in a box and locking it away. I should have gone straight to my room, but I didn't. I stopped halfway down the hall, turning my head just enough to look back. The door was still open. Not wide, just slightly ajar, like he had started to close it, and then hesitated. A breath caught in my throat. I stood there, staring at the sliver of darkness beyond that door, waiting for something I didn't have a name for. A sign, a sound, a reason to turn back. But nothing came. Minutes passed, maybe a lifetime, and then finally the door clicked shut. Soft. Final. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if that could steady the storm still raging inside me. This was supposed to be the end, but somehow it didn't feel like it. Somehow it felt like the beginning of something much, much worse. Some lines can't be uncrossed. Some moments can't be undone. Now they're left standing on opposite sides of a boundary that never should have been breached. But was it truly the end? Or just the start of something even more dangerous? The silence lingers. The tension simmers beneath the surface. One glance, one slip, and everything could spiral again. What would you do if the one thing you couldn't have was the one thing you couldn't resist?